anticipate what the president's going to say, because I'm sure he's going to like what happened with the tax cuts. What would you agree with him on? What did the tax cuts actually do that you think was a good thing for the economy and for American business?
Well, look, I was not against cutting corporate rates. I wish we did that in a way that was paid for, but I think that's the best thing about the tax plan, is making the U.S. tax system more competitive relative to other countries' tax systems. I have no problem with that. I think that there's a lot that's positive. I think on the downside, it wasn't paid for. It's going to increase the deficit by some $2 trillion. And it's heavily pushing in the direction of the same income inequality we've had. So this is a massive tax cut for high-income people and big corporations. And it was sold as this is going to increase the wages of ordinary people in America, and it hasn't done that. And of course it hasn't done that. We knew it wasn't going to do that. They sold it on completely different grounds than what it was.
Well, let's try to take their position for a second, because I think if they were here, whoever the they is, they would say what this is going to do is going to increase capital investment, which will increase productivity and ultimately benefit the workers as well as everybody else. Thus far, what's the report card? Is there an uptick in capital investment since the tax cuts went into effect?
Barely. In the first quarter of GDP of this year, as you know, we grew only 2%. It was a small increase in capital investment. Hopefully, we're going to see in the second quarter an increase. But as has been documented by most people repeatedly, the vast majority of the money was not used for capital investment. It was paid out in dividends or in share repurchases. So do we feel better that there was a massive transfer from the U.S. Treasury of $2 trillion over 10 years to shareholders and people that received dividends, and they paid out an executive compensation? Maybe, but I kind of think that juxtaposition, that let's give a giant tax cut to people whose taxes are already low and don't need it, is why the bill is still remarkably unpopular. Only 34% of the country has a positive impression of the tax bill, and I think that's because they've looked at it.
That is true, but at the same time, it has sharply increased business confidence, consumer sentiment as well. On the other side, though, I do have to ask, what's the risk of overheating a full employment economy such as the U.S.?
Well, what is the risk? I think there is some risk. You've seen the Fed talk about that. The time to do a $2 trillion tax cut is when the unemployment rate is high and you're wanting some extra juice for the economy. It's usually not thought of as when you're at or around full employment and the threat of the economy overheating is potentially quite big.
And of course, today we are seeing Canada retaliating with their own tariffs after the U.S. imposed steel and aluminum tariffs. I got to ask, at what point do we start saying that this is an all-out trade war against China, against allies, against Europe, Canada?
Let's hope we don't have to say that. You know, it's the irony here is Donald Trump's major political accomplishment was passing the tax bill, and they're going to celebrate it today, and it was a significant political accomplishment. And the economy has continued to improve. That's the strongest thing he's got going for him. Why simultaneously threaten trade wars with all of our major allies plus China and put that at risk? And I just don't understand that.
So, Austin, put some rough numbers on this, if you could. I think most economists that we talk to think that the tax cuts added between 0.3 and 0.5% in GDP growth in this year and maybe next. On the other hand, they're saying that with the trade difficulties, you'll take another 0.1 to 0.3 off. Do those numbers sound right to you? What are your estimates?
That might be right. It all, on the trade side, depends critically on how big does it get and how much retaliation and counter-retaliation and counter-retaliation do we get. So if the U.S. put in these tariffs and Canada and Europe and China did something comparable to that in return, and we all just kind of pointed fingers at each other and said, and don't ever do that again, It would be bad. It will cost us thousands of jobs, but it won't have that big of a material impact on GDP growth.
Okay.
If this thing spirals in the way that it has seemed to, at least in the rhetoric, where Trump says 50 billion on China, China says 50 billion on you, and he says, well, if that's 50, then 100 on you, and they say, well, then 100 on you, then 200 on you. If we do that, the cost will be far greater than a few tenths of a percent. I think if the two largest economies of the world get in an outright trade war with each other, we're going to have both of us are going to have a recession.
And putting aside China for a moment, it seems to be that automobiles may be on deck. In fact, we've just heard that, in fact, if automobiles were included, that would really hurt Canada, for example. We've heard things from Germany. How bad would it be if we actually did impose those tariffs on automobiles?
I think it'd be pretty bad. But look, to put the tariffs on steel is taxing a thing which is an input for a whole bunch of the manufacturing industries in the United States, which is exactly what they say they're trying to help. So it doesn't. This is being done by people who clearly don't understand the supply chain for American manufacturing. You can't put taxes on the inputs for American manufacturing and expect them to grow. They're not going to grow. They're going to shrink. And that's before you even get the retribution from other countries saying, oh, yeah, well, if you're going to put it on our steel, then we're going to put it on your cars. And here we go. I mean, that's how you get off to the races. So I'm hoping that wiser heads or calmer heads are going to prevail here, and that this will go in the category of things the president tweeted out that he didn't actually do. It was more of a bluster, more of a positioning thing.